Okay, super. Bomo nadaljevali. I will continue now in English because Jeff will also speak in English, and I hope then the discussion can be in English as well. If anyone is a bit if for anyone it's awkward to ask questions in English afterwards, you can also ask it in Slovene, and we'll translate. Jeff will speak and then answer in English. Our guest speaker for the symposium is Jeff Halper. He's a professor of anthropology. He was born in America, and he moved to Israel in 1973. He, in the 90s, looking what happened after the Oslo, in 1997, he established the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. It was one of the important and very prominent organizations that was fighting against Israeli destruction of Palestinian houses. He also knew and worked with Rachel Corrie, who was killed in Gaza by an Israeli bulldozer. And in 2017, he decided, or he was one of the founders, together with Palestinians, who decided to start One Democratic State coalition. Campaign, sorry, I knew. So this is something that's now been somehow active or has been continuing and trying to grow for the last 7 years. He has also written numerous books, two of them that I will mention. The first is War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians and Global Pacification. It's a book that also touches on something that was already mentioned today, and this is the Israeli army industry and how they export the model that they develop and then practice on Palestinians. And his last book is Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. I will leave now the floor to Jeff. He has a PowerPoint presentation as well. And as before, your questions, contributions, thoughts are very welcome.
I'm better at standing when I do my... Somehow sitting doesn't get all the energy out. So, thank you very much, all of you, for coming, the university, and for inviting me, and Christina and Anya and many other people that have hosted me the last couple days here. It's not my first time in Ljubljana, but it's my first time at the university. I'm the head of an organization called the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. We began our work in 1997, actually, as an activist group focusing on the issue of house demolitions. Israel's demolished, roughly, since 1967, about 60,000 Palestinian homes in the West Bank and Gaza until October 7th. That on the top of course, about another 60,000 homes, entire villages, towns, urban areas during the Nakba, in 1948 and afterwards. In Gaza, since October 7th, of course, something like 300,000 homes have been demolished. You've seen it. Not only the whole northern part of Gaza, but a good part of the south as well, completely flattened. But now Israeli military and settlement facilities are being built on top of all of that. So, house demolitions began as, one of the issues. There were other groups dealing with other kinds of issues, settlements and the wall and so on, and we focused on demolitions. But we really kind of discovered that we had backed into kind of the essence of the whole thing, which is really one group replacing another group in the country. So house demolitions wasn't only another issue, it was really the essence of it all, because in English at least, home and homeland, are connected terms. So if you deny Palestinians, both inside Israel and in the occupied territories, a home, the message is not only you will never have a home here, you have no place in this country, get out, but collectively, it really means you as a people have no place in this country, get out. So it's much more than symbolic. It really it gets to the core, as some of the people that spoke before me mentioned, of the whole issue of ethnic cleansing and transforming Palestine into Israel. But we've always been a political organization. I mean, we do the resistance work, we rebuild homes, we resist the demolition of homes. I get in front of bulldozers, which is why I'm built this way. And we write a lot about it and so on, and do a lot of advocacy around it. But we're a political organization, and we do believe, for all the difficulties, that there has to be a political solution, and resistance is not enough. We have to really come out with a political plan. And as it's been perfectly made clear this morning, the two-state solution is not that plan. And there really is no plan, in a sense. We'll talk about that. And so, over the last few years, it's a Palestinian-led organization, the One Democratic State campaign, with anti-Zionist Israelis like me involved. And we formulated together a 10-point political program. I'll mention it, briefly. And we're really the first organization that has really come out with a detailed political plan that's an alternative to this two-state idea and so on. We're having a meeting on Wednesday in Ramallah, actually, which I think is very important because we've made the decision now, and it's been very difficult for the Palestinians. I won't get into all of that. Fear, repression, but also the whole issue of, it's a really interesting issue of how does civil society work in resistance and work politically in a way outside of a national liberation framework, because the PLO has basically been dismantled, the political parties are dysfunctional, there's no national leadership, and yet there still is a national liberation movement. And so the question that the Palestinians in our organization have debated is, do we have a mandate to step out with a political program and take a leadership role? Are we inside the national liberation movement, or are we outside? And we don't want to be outside, or they don't want to be outside. And so there's been a lot of negotiations within the Palestinian community, and they've made the decision that, yes, we are going to step out. So we'll see, maybe it's a very important decision, I think, that would transform the One Democratic campaign from an activist group, a thought forum, a discussion group, both within the Palestinian community but also outside, into an actual political organization that will push a political program, get people to join, and try to mobilize people abroad. So that's sort of that framework. But what I'd like to do today is, build on what's been said this morning and really kind of give a more comprehensive view, as I see it at least, of where we are and what the problem is. And I think we have to begin, we all know this in universities, the concepts we use are crucial for the analysis. In other words, if you have the wrong concepts, you have the wrong analysis. And that's been the case all these years, because everything, all the discussion, all the negotiations politically have been based around the idea of a conflict. This is a conflict. We all use that term. The Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even the Palestinians use that word. But it's not a conflict. And, if you misdiagnose, there's a reason why negotiations have never worked. The reason why people continue to pursue this two-state idea, even though it makes no sense if you have the proper analysis. And that has to do with the idea of conflict, because conflict has set up this false and misleading and even destructive analytical framework on which everything else has flowed, but it's a wrong framework. And that's why everything has been so confused and a failure. Because a conflict involves two sides, right? Two or more sides. But there's sides. I mean, you have a conflict, and you have a fight about something, and so you have sides. Well, what I'm going to argue today, and you've all heard the term, and colonialism was brought up this morning a little bit, I think in a different context, but Zionism is a settler colonial movement. I mean, you have to define what Zionism is. It has a national element to it. Jews began to redefine themselves, at least Zionist Jews, as a national group. It was a national movement coming into Palestine, but it took the form of a settler colonial enterprise. So that if we call this a conflict and we make the Zionists a side, what are we really doing? Settler colonialism is illegal. I mean, there are international laws against colonialism. It's illegal, it's immoral, it's unjust. We all know how cruel it is to the degree of genocide that's built into settler colonialism. You can't take over someone else's country without genocide. But by making them, the Zionists in Israel, a side to a conflict, you're elevating an illegal, unjust, immoral settler enterprise into something that's legitimate. Once I'm a side, now I have that legitimacy. So great, in other words, calling it a conflict legitimizes a side that should not be a side. There is no justification. Zionism has no grounds for negotiating with Palestinians in terms of anything. And now look at it the other way. What does the side do to the Palestinians themselves? I mean, this is the indigenous population. It's their country. They lived in that country forever. They don't have to justify their claims or why they're living there or why they have a right to be in Palestine. That kind of a artificial narrative that the colonists have to develop to justify why the country belongs to them and not to the indigenists. The indigenists don't have to do that. They don't have to justify their rights. But by making them a side, you've taken away all of that from them. You've put them into this little tiny box that's a side, and now they have to justify their own existence. And you're forcing them to, how do you end a conflict? You end it through negotiations and compromise. Well, what are we expecting the Palestinians to compromise about? That 78% of their country is now somebody else's country? Well, now let's negotiate. Maybe we can make Israel 77% of Palestine. Maybe we'll get 76. What do we have to negotiate as Palestinians? How many refugees have a right to return? And who determines that? The colonists determine how many of the indigenous population can return to their own country? You can see how unjust and destructive this kind of an idea of a conflict is. Because you're making a false symmetry between two groups that are not equal, they don't have equal rights, and in fact, one of which has no rights whatsoever and is immoral and unjust and shouldn't be there. And the other side that should not have to justify its own existence and its own rights. So conflict is not a good concept to begin with, and that's why the negotiations have failed all these years. Because partly in a conflict, in negotiations, you also need if there is a conflict, you need good faith. Well, if you think that Israel just sees itself as a side that is actually in good faith going to negotiate with Palestinians who are conceived as an equal side, you're completely, it's delusional. Israelis don't see themselves as a side. They see themselves as entitled to the entire country. It's their country. It's the land of Israel. We're coming back. We're taking it over. And there is no Palestinian people. Israel has never, ever, ever recognized the existence of a Palestinian people, let alone its national rights. In Oslo, in the golden days of Oslo, all Israel did was recognize the PLO as a negotiating partner. That was it. And there was no commitment to a two-state solution anywhere in Oslo. And so we went into 7 years of futile negotiations over nothing. Even the important issues, the final status issues, were put to the end in 5 years. And, at which time the whole thing collapsed. So that's the first problem. We're using the wrong analytical framework. Instead, we should be talking about settler colonialism. And what's interesting about it is, a lot of our academic concepts kind of stay within our rarefied academic world, Settler colonialism, which is a mouthful, has somehow escaped the university. And it's gotten into the popular discourse. You hear it all the time from activists. Zionism and settler colonialism has become kind of a mantra, actually. But it's not completely understood. It's used more as an accusation, again, or as a form of delegitimization, rather than an actual analytical concept that should be unpacked and used in order to bring about political understanding and a political program. So that settler colonialism is not a side. Settler colonialism is unilateral. There was never a conflict between Palestinians and Jews. Jews had lived in Palestine for millennia. They were Arab Jews, not only in Palestine, but throughout the Arab world, Arab Jews. Arab was not simply Muslim. Anybody participating in that culture was an Arab, Christians or Muslims or Jews or anyone. So there was never a conflict. What happened was Palestine was invaded unilaterally by Zionist Jews from Europe. Right? So there's no side here. It isn't like they got into a fight. They were invaded. So we can't make a symmetry. We can't compare the violence of invader colonists to the resistance of the indigenous population, which is exactly what conflict does. It creates that false symmetry. So if we understand that settler colonialism is unilateral and that the indigenous people are resisting, that's a whole different way of looking at this now. Now that opens the way to really beginning to think about what kinds of solutions are possible or where are we going, and what do the Palestinians have to do in order to liberate themselves. But it also has to do with what happens to Israelis. Because one of the real problems of settler colonialism, and this is what Palestinians are really struggling with, is that the settlers don't leave. In very few cases, like Algeria, the settlers left. But in the vast majority of settler colonial cases, you talk about the United States, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and there's many other examples I won't get into. The settlers remain. That's a part of what Mahmoud Mamdani, if you know some of his work, he calls a colonial legacy. He said, in classical colonialism, the colonists leave. When the French left Syria, they left Syria. They left a terrible colonial legacy in Syria, which we're still seeing being played out until today, but they left and Syria became Syria. In settler colonialism, the settlers don't leave. They remain a part of the population. And in Israel, Palestine, they're half the population. There's 7 million Israeli Jews in the country, and 7 million Palestinian Arabs, plus another 6 to 7 refugees, 6 to 7 million refugees on the outside. So that's what, one of the things, liberation would be easier if it was classical colonialization. You could throw the colonists out and take over the country. The problem is, even after liberation, whatever that means, the settlers are going to remain. The Israelis are going to remain. Now, how do we work with that? So it's much more difficult proposition of decolonizing settler colonialism than it is classical colonialism. But at any rate, what I'm saying is, instead of conflict, we should ban that word, and we should be talking about an anti-colonial struggle against Zionist settler colonialism. That's the name. And once you name something, with a good, making a case for why you're naming it that, then that becomes the framework. This should be the analytical framework we work from, rather than this. And struggle is a much better word, because struggle is, it's a struggle. It doesn't imply that there's more sides. It doesn't imply that who you're struggling against is legitimate. It's a struggle that's defined by you. This is a struggle defined by Palestinians. And that's why it's a much better framework, that we should work out of. I'm at a university, so I thought I'd just show this. I'm not going to, I don't have hours to talk about it. But one of the points is that settler colonialism has a pattern to it. It has a logic to it. Zionist settler colonialism is not unique. It's not unique in its concept. It's not unique in its logic, and it's not unique in its patterns. In the stages that it went through, from the impetus to go out and colonize Palestine, to the settlement idea. Settlement, of course, being the main mechanism by which settler colonial movements actually impose themselves on the target country. Foundational violence, because it's always a violent campaign, obviously. And then you develop regimes, once you have a foothold, regimes of what I call dominance management. A whole kind of a colonial system of structures of domination and control that you put into place, because you don't want to be in violence forever. You want to begin to control the populations. We see that in Israel after 48, when they put in the military government for 20 years. And we see it in the West Bank, of course, in the occupation. And this is really important, and then the settler colonial project wins, if it succeeds. And there are, of course, the United States is probably the best example of that. And here it's really interesting. How does it doesn't win in a victory sense, in a military sense. That would be easier, because if you have a victory, you still have the other parties there. You have to negotiate what happens after the victory. Settler colonialism ends with normalization, which is a dry, gray, I hate to say academic term, but it is. Go try to mobilize people against normalization. But it's it's more powerful than victory, because normalization is a closure. It just ends everything. Once a settler colonial situation is normalized, there's nowhere else to go. It's normal. It's done. It's over. And there's no room for resistance, really. There's no real way to change it. And so that's the danger, I think, that Palestinians are facing today. And it's interesting that Biden and Trump, I'm sure, never read a book on settler colonialism. I don't think Trump ever read a book at all. Absolutely. But they use the same terminology. both Trump and Biden are the whole Abraham Accords, and where Biden was really pushing until October 7th, when Hamas messed up the timeline, was normalization. We're in a process of normalization between Israel and the Arab countries, So that it's interesting that they've taken that same term because the logic is there of how do you end this thing. And if normalization does come about, the Palestinians are really lost. Because, first of all, they're not a part of it, really. And second of all, that, again, takes away any ability to resist because the perception universally is that it's over. It's been normalized, now we move on to something else. But the other side, of course, of the progress of settler colonialism is also resistance. And so the resistance movement also goes through certain phases. And it's always important for us to look at the resistance. At some point, the resistance, and that happened with the PLO, of course, and it didn't succeed. And now, if I can say modestly, there's hopes that our kind of a mobilization might begin to do that. Resistance is not enough. You've got to take the resistance movement and translate it into a political program, a political movement, a political organization, and so on, if you want to, in the end, defeat settler colonialism. And that's what we call summoning power, a whole decolonization process. But so decolonization is the opposite of conflict resolution. Because conflict resolution, again, is based on compromising and basically leaving all the structures of control and the power differentials in place, right? Whereas, because even in negotiations is a strong party that's going to impose certain conditions and structures. Whereas decolonization is what actually ends settler colonialism in the meaningful sense and creates a new political situation that you can build upon. All right, I'm not going to get too much into this, but just really briefly, there's 3 stages of Zionist colonization, but more important in some ways, there's 3 stages of normalization. I'm really trying to develop this. We don't use that term very often in academic discussions or in political science. It's not, I don't think Kissinger ever used the word normalization. But it's a very important word, at least in this context. So I want to show, in a way, the 3 stages also of normalization. So stage 1 of the Zionist enterprise was, roughly between 1882, when the first proto-Zionist settlers came to Palestine, until 1947. And here, like the map that was up before, we have, until 1947, you had Palestine as a coherent entity. And this is the map of Palestine. Although it's a European map, in the sense that there was no Palestine that had borders. And this is, I think, really important. Again, we can't get into this because the Yugoslavian example has been used this morning and everything else. Nationalism, of course, in the Middle East is completely different from nationalism in Europe. You never had a concept of a nation, an exclusive or a defined nation in the Arab world. You never had the concept of a state in the Arab. We had empires, and you had tribal, whatever, but you never had states. And the idea of a nation state is really foreign. Instead, Arab nationalism is a cultural nationalism in which all the Arab peoples are one nation in a kind of a sense, an ummah. And we know that, during World War I, when the Arabs joined the British in the war, the idea was that there would be one Arab state, or whatever you want to call it, between Iraq and Egypt and Yemen that would emerge. That was so Palestine is actually not a discrete unit. The Palestinians never wanted this. This is, in a sense, imposed on them by the Zionists and by the British, because when the British and French partitioned the Middle East, these were the units they created. And then following that, the identities kind of had to begin to fit into the units. So after World War I, Woodrow Wilson, because he was so much a partisan of self-determination, sent a commission to Palestine, the King Crane Commission, to ask the people of Palestine what did they want, in the wake of the war. And virtually 100% almost of the Palestinians said, we want to be a part of Shams, of Greater Syria. There was no idea of a Palestine as a national group, a national entity with borders. There wasn't any of that. So to the degree that we're even referring to this map, in a way we're referring to a map that was imposed on them. And in many ways, the whole Palestinian national movement is artificial. I think they were only forced to become a Palestinian national movement, again, because of the European parameters that were imposed upon them. So, at any rate, the point is that Palestine was invaded by the Zionists with the intent of transforming an Arab country into a Jewish one. The entire country. Not 78% of it, the entire country was the land of Israel, and there were no Arabs or Palestinians in the equation whatsoever. They didn't exist. This is completely unilateral. This is our story as Jews, as Zionists, coming back to our country with our ideology. So the Palestinians are erased from the very beginning from any of Zionist narrative. They don't play a role, they don't exist. And what's important is that very quickly became true of the international community as well. Because the first stage of normalization was the Balfour Declaration, 1917, drafted by Chaim Weizmann, who was the Zionist leader in the UK, in England, and that became official British. And before the Balfour Declaration, there were 10 Zionists in the world running around. They didn't represent anybody really in the Jewish communities. Very few people. But the Balfour Declaration gave them that international legitimacy, that normalization, in a sense, for anti-Semitic reasons. Balfour, Lloyd George were all anti-Semitic. Partly they believed the Jews controlled the world and they needed them to win World War I, which Chaim Weizmann encouraged that line of thought. And they were also Christian Zionists, that believed, as it was said this morning, that, Jews had to be restored to the land of Israel as a precondition for the second coming of Christ and all of that. But the point is that the Balfour Declaration not only normalized and legitimized Zionism, but it also erased the Palestinians. The Balfour Declaration never mentions, not Palestinian, it never mentions the word Arab. 90% of the population of this country is Arab. Not mentioned. You have a promise that the British government will foster the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, but the Arabs are called the existing non-Jewish communities. So from the beginning, Zionism is normalized and the Palestinians are erased. And the Jews become the only national group with national rights in the country. And the Balfour Declaration was taken whole cloth into the League of Nations mandate of 1922. Word for word. So now the League of Nations is mandating the British to foster a Jewish national home in Palestine with no relation whatsoever to the Arab population. And then, of course, we get up to 1947. In 1947, you have the UN Partition Plan, right? In which the UN, now it's the UN instead of the League of Nations, with no authority whatsoever, decides to partition Palestine. And what do? They give 56% of Palestine to the Jews. Now, the Jews were only a third of the population at that time. Most of them were newcomers. They'd been there for 15, 20 years before 1947, maybe 25 years. They got 56% of the country, and the Arab state, as it was called, was 42%. The other 2% being Jerusalem and Bethlehem that were internationalized. So, again, normalization by the UN at this time of the Zionist enterprise, and the Zionists agreed knowing that the Palestinians were not going to agree. I mean, why? No colonial people is going to agree that somebody gives 56% of their country to somebody else. And so they knew there'd be a war, the Zionists, and they agreed. So the second stage is the war. It begins with the war. In 1947, 1948, what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Jews, Israelis call it our war of independence, in which half of the territory allocated to the Palestinians by the UN was now conquered by Israel, and we get the familiar map that we know today. This is the map of the ceasefire lines. These are not borders. They have no real legal standing. They're simply ceasefire lines. This is what emerged out of 1948. But what's interesting, again, is the process of normalization, because this becomes the map. And what happens now, 1967 happens. Israel conquers the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. All right? But the map kind of remains because these become now the occupied territories. And to show you the power of normalization, 1993, or actually 1998, when the PLO accepted the two-state idea, but 1993, when they go into the Oslo negotiations, now they are negotiating with the Israelis. Where do they start? Negotiating over how much land could be how big a Palestinian state would be. They start here. They don't start here. I mean, Arafat himself, the PLO themselves, had already internalized that this is the map. So what happens now is, this is what we're negotiating. Well, if this is it, then the 78% of Palestine that's Israel is out of the equation. We're not even talking about it. That's done. That's normalized. It's okay, even for the Palestinians. And now what we're negotiating is the 22%. Well, the 22% becomes then 100% of what we're negotiating. Well, anybody will tell you that if you're negotiating, you're not going to get 100%. So now the question is how much of the 22% can the Palestinians negotiate? So this is, through 67, and then in 67, of course, the possibility of a Palestinian state, if you do look at the map, arose. So the first thing the Israelis did immediately after 67, first of all, annex East Jerusalem. So East Jerusalem was taken out of the occupied territory from the very beginning. In Oslo, there was no mention of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was non-negotiable. All we're negotiating is the West Bank and Gaza. So Jerusalem, which is, as somebody mentioned it this morning, the economic heart of Palestine, of any Palestinian state, of course, its cultural, religious center is taken out from the very beginning. And then Israel begins to develop what I call a matrix of control over the West Bank, and that's the settlement enterprise. All these blue dots and these pink areas are the settlements and highways that then incorporated the West Bank into Israel. We stopped using the word West Bank. Israel, if you say it today, Israelis don't know what you're talking about. West Bank of what, the Mississippi? We talk about Judea and Samaria. We use so the whole country has been reconceptualized, and then you have Oslo, and then in Oslo, what happens is it's further partitioned, the West Bank, into areas A, B, and C. I'm not going to get into that, but you get a Palestinian Authority established that's a collaborationist authority. It's a Palestinian government established with the permission of Israel, whose mission is to support Israeli security. They're a subcontractor for Israeli security in the West Bank against terrorism. And that's what they are until today. There's no political program of the Palestinian authorities. They would never go out against Israel. They're subcontractors. They work. It's as if Mandela worked for de Klerk and the ANC had become part of the South African government. That's really the equivalent. And so now you have a Palestinian Authority ruling over area A and B. That's 40% of the West Bank and Gaza, although they lost Gaza to Hamas. So, in other words, now the Palestinians have an authority that Slovenia has recognized as a state over 40% of 22% of their country. And that, of course, truncated into all these little islands. And in case you didn't get the message, Israel built a wall. We call it the Apartheid wall, a 12-meter high wall around areas A and B. You see, to really, in concrete, to tell the world this is all the Palestinians are going to get. Because Israel needs a two-state solution. Don't get me wrong. Israel needs it because there's 5 million Palestinians in the occupied territory, right? That they can't give citizenship to. If they took the whole thing, what do you do with 5 million Palestinians? You couldn't be a Jewish state if you gave them citizenship. So you've got to have a Palestinian Bantustan, exactly the same concept as South Africa, and the same proportion. South Africa had 89% of South Africa was for white people, and 11% was all these little tiny Bantustans that were never recognized by the international community. Here you've got 85% of the country now becomes Israel, and the Palestinians maybe will get 10 to 15%. That truncated into 3 separate islands of the West Bank and what's ever left of Gaza. But this Bantustan, with the same logic, the same structure, the same size almost as those in South Africa, is recognized by the international community. It's as if Slovenia had recognized Transkei as a country that was one of the Bantustans in South Africa. Imagine if the Bantustans had been recognized, how much more difficult it would have been for the ANC to create a democratic government over all of South Africa. You would have had 12 different countries that you had to deal with. But they were never recognized, and so it was clear that there was one apartheid South Africa. Here, it's much more complicated for Palestinians because they're always running into the thing. As soon as we're trying to end apartheid and create a democratic state in all of Palestine, or Palestine-Israel, you always come back, no, but there's a Palestinian state. And we recognize the Palestinian state. So in other words, by recognizing the Bantustan, you make things infinitely more difficult for Palestinians. And then we get into Trump's plan, because now we're in the third stage, which is actually really normalizing the whole thing, ending this conflict, ending this whole issue. And Trump's plan, is very clear. I mean, he presented a map. It's not like we have to guess what the plan is now that he's coming back. And completing the Abraham Accords is his first priority. He appointed 3 people already just to deal with that, plus his son-in-law. And this is Netanyahu's map, a counterproposal, which is more restrictive, but basically kind of the same. The point is that you can see the apartheid even more clearly here. The first principle of the Trump deal of the century is that all the settlements remain. Jerusalem, of course, has already been recognized by the United States. It moved its embassy there. Biden did not move it back to Tel Aviv, and so Jerusalem is gone. The settlements are there, and the role of the settlements is partly, of course, to divide the Palestinian cantons, into cantons, enclaves, that then even if they become kind of a mini-state, they're all controlled by Israel, because Israel controls the movement from the north to the center to the south, and then, of course, to Gaza. Israel controls the borders. Israel controls, there almost is no economy. I think you and some other people mentioned that today. There really is no, it's a non-viable state. Israel controls all the resources, including the water. And it was mentioned this morning, the natural gas deposits off Gaza. Israel controls the airspace. Israel controls the electromagnetic sphere, which is communications in the Palestinian state. And Israel insists that there always be an Israeli military presence inside the Palestinian state. Take all that, and what are you talking about? Really a two-state solution? I mean, this is really a viable, sovereign Palestinian state? It's clear that it isn't, and it's also clear that this exactly conforms to where settler colonialism was always going. It got to the point, this is the point where it has to be normalized. Israel can't get any more, because then they would be having to take Palestinians in an Israeli that they don't want to do. And the Palestinians can't get any more, because this has all been accepted by the international community, pretty much. And so this is where we are today, facing in the next few months the prospect of normalization. If Saudi Arabia falls into place, which it probably will fairly quickly. And what's interesting now is Syria, because Saudi Arabia is having a tough time joining the Abraham Accords with Israel after Gaza. There's tremendous opposition to that in the Arab street, of course. And even in Saudi Arabia, there's public opinion. But if Syria could be brought in, then it would be a whole different situation. And Jolani and some of the Syrians have kind of indicated that they want to be friends with Israel. They don't want, and Israel had relations with them even before. And of course, Israel's now destroyed their military for the most part. So there is a possibility, especially if Saudi Arabia now exerts some pressures. And of course, the new government is very much against Iran and Hezbollah and so on. There's a possibility that Syria, sooner or later, could also join the Abraham Accords. So the Arab states are complicit in normalizing this situation. And here's Netanyahu in the UN, 2 weeks before October 7th, showing the map of the new Middle East. This is him. I mean, this isn't AI. This is a picture of him on the podium of the General Assembly, the new Middle East. And here's Israel, from the river to the sea. Now, even though, as I mentioned, Israel needs a two-state solution, the Palestinian bathroom zone is so small that it couldn't even fit on this little tiny dot. I mean, Israel's small, imagine. So, the hell with just show this map. It's much easier, and it's really the reality. A greater Israel within a Middle East like that. Genocide, of course, is built into the whole thing. I'm not going to get into Gaza, but I'm not going to do that now. All right, 2 more minutes, okay? If then a two-state solution is not, I mean, now it's not an argument. I would think now, I mean, not that I'm the brilliant, but I mean, once you plug into the logic of settler colonialism, it leads you somewhere, by itself. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure out where it's going. So I think it ends by itself, the two-state idea. There is no way a settler colonial project of creating a Jewish state in Palestine could ever accept a genuine, let's say, as genuine as you can get. I mean, you could make an argument that this two-state might have worked. I mean, it's not just, but Palestinians would have borders with Arab countries. Palestinians would have control of their water. If this really worked, they'd have East Jerusalem. So they would have that economic hub and religious hub and so on. Tourism is the largest industry in Palestine. They would have, territorial contiguity. The settlements would be gone. There would be what's called a safe passage with Gaza. Gaza could have a seaport. It has a seaport. I sailed into it in 2008. And it could have an airport again. In other words, you could make the case that small, but it could be made viable. But of course, that was never in the cards because we know that Israel would never ever allow a large, from the Israeli point of view, contiguous, viable Palestinian sovereign state to emerge in the heart of Judea and Samaria, including East Jerusalem. And so then we go to apartheid, and assuming apartheid is not acceptable to us, although I can't speak for our governments, the only alternative is one state. And I just want to really, just in 2 minutes, now a minute and a half, just lay it out, because it's really simple. I mean, the first stage, I'm not going to get into it, is decolonization. You have to decolonize. You have to dismantle all the structures of domination and control of settler colonialism. That's kind of the first stage. And then when you have kind of that cleared, the idea of one democratic state is fairly straightforward, almost like in South Africa. And in fact, we look at the South African Constitution as one of the models for what we're trying to develop. In other words, no tricks. Because you have today all kinds of programs, I have to tell you, of Zionists, largely left Zionists, that are scrambling. They know the two states not going to work. How do we salvage a Jewish state in a one-state framework? That's what. So you have these plans of confederation and federation and cantonization, and there's a million plans out there. But they're all, and the Palestinians know it's a trick. One state, but, our cantons are in the most fertile parts of the country. One state, but we control the army. One state, there's always a but in there. We erase the but. So that one constitution, one parliament, one citizenship for everyone, I mean, Israeli Jews, everybody living in the country, has equal citizen in a democratic state. One set of laws and so on, period. Now that gives the possibility of the refugees to return, because without that, nothing is going to work for Palestinians. The refugees that want to return are able to return, and one of the problems, of course, with the even with this better two-state solution, was that it was incapable of accepting refugees. I mean, it's just too small. And so you had to eliminate the refugee. That was unacceptable from the beginning for Palestinians. They come back, individual rights, like you have in every democracy. And then I have to, and what that does, and this is the hopeful part. We mentioned hope. I don't really like the word hope very much, but the hopeful part, let's say, is that it not only kind of frees, it creates an equality, it creates a new situation. There is a good economy. The Israeli-Palestinian economy would be very good. Palestinians are very educated. It isn't like South Africa. We were talking about, the black African population starting from zero. And the Palestinians could achieve economic parity, I think, with Israelis within a half a generation. Plus, they have a huge diaspora that would invest as well. But, and what that does is it allows a new civil society to emerge. Our concept is, this is one state, a civil state, all right? Now, it could be called Palestine, although 40% of the population is probably Israeli Jews. It's not very inclusive. You might call it Palestine, Israel. I don't know what we're going to call it. It has to be, in a way, we have to invent a new state. So let's call it for the meantime Zatar. Do you know Zatar? It's a Palestinian spice, and we'll all be Zatarians. All right? The point is that in this, you can be a Zatarian. You can be a young people move on. That's what's great about young people. They move on really quickly. Because people say, well, what about the genocide? And what about, all this history of, it's all there, of course, and it has to be dealt with. But young people want to move on. And if there's a good economy, and if people are living together and working together, I think they will begin to move on. And in this kind of a situation, in our view, it is binational. You do have two national groups in the country. You can't ignore that. We're not just individual citizens, but each group gets a kind of a cultural self-determination. So if you're Palestinian, nobody's going to close Birzeit University. Arabic is still the language. You have your literature. You have your religious festivals. You live in the entire country. And for Israeli Jews, the same thing. Nobody's going to close the Hebrew University, stop you from speaking Hebrew. In other words, both groups have full cultural national expression, but within the framework of a civil democracy. And what that does is it lets people decide. How much do I want to be within my community? And how much do I just want to be? What if I'm a Palestinian and I fall in love with an Israeli? So there'll be civil marriage in this country. In other words, you can choose how much you want to live your life as an individual or how much you want to remain within the framework. Refugees need a Palestinian framework when they come back. They're not going to jump into a civil society. Religious people would need more of that kind of, so you give people that sort of a choice. And that's the final word is that this is not the majority view, the view that we're trying to, because most Palestinians will say, and this is the main split within the one democratic state movement, most Palestinians say no. It has to be a Palestinian state. That's liberation. Liberation is liberation. You can't have our liberation without a Palestinian state. Israeli Jews can stay. Israeli Jews will get equal citizenship, but they won't be recognized as a national group. There's only one national group, that's Palestinian, and so it's a Palestinian state, citizenship for everybody, but only one national group. In our view, it might be just, but it's a recipe for conflict. Because you can suppress, Israeli Jews, whether they should or shouldn't be, are a national group. After 70-some years of sovereignty as a state, they are a national group. And that's a colonial legacy that we talked about before that the Palestinians have to accept, I think. And so we're saying a Palestinian state might be the most moral, but what's going to actually work is a civil state in which you have your identity and your cultural life, but the state belongs to all its citizens and not to one particular group. So I'm sorry if I talked too long, but I did come here from Jerusalem, so so anyway, thank you for listening.
Okay. Jeff, thank you very much. And now the questions, please.
Or comments or arguments.
Yes, and the button somewhere there, so that it's perfect.
Okay, thank you very much for very interesting lecture. However, I have at least two questions. So even if one would allow, all those Palestinian refugees into this one civil state, Palestine, and on the basis of the demographic trends, don't you think that even with some stimulation of this civil society identity, civil identity of those citizens, the fact behind all of it would still be that perhaps in 10 years, Palestinians could make, a great majority of population. Don't you think that would be quite fearful that there should be, or there we can understand that there is some fear of Jewish population if this would be the case. And secondly, how do you think it would be possible to overcome this powerful Zionist idea, which has been there, for such a long time, for almost 1 century?
And internationalized as well.
Yes.
Well, all right, let me just, this is a contention. It's not I'm arguing this. It's not that it's necessarily going to happen. My assumption is, look, Israeli Jews are not going to accept this for 2 reasons. One is fear, because there will be a Palestinian majority. I mean, even if the refugees don't come back, there'll still be a Palestinian majority. And at the same time, it's fear, but also the opposition to ending apartheid. I mean, the whites in South Africa Mandela could have talked to them for 1 million years. I mean, why would they end apartheid? They're on top. They have all the resources. They have the sovereignty. They have the power. Why would Israelis dismantle this? They wouldn't. So we have to start with the assumption that the Israelis are not a part of this, the Israeli Jews. And no, I know South Africa isn't a one-to-one correspondence, but there's a lot we can learn. I think there are a lot of useful parallels. And one of them is that the whites in South Africa did not accept the end of apartheid. And so what the ANC did is it bypassed them, basically. It went to us, all of us of a certain age, and we were all in the anti-apartheid movement, which was, I think the Palestinian movement is beginning now, I think has risen to the level of the anti-apartheid movement worldwide. But you had that movement, and I think that movement, plus what was happening inside South Africa, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons, caused the collapse of the apartheid regime. In other words, our task, somebody mentioned, our task in the previous session, our task is to make the Israeli apartheid regime unsustainable. Economically, politically, make it so immoral, and I think we're moving to that direction, that corporations not only will divest, corporations won't want anything to do with it. They won't want to be associated with it. When Ford Motor Company pulled out of South Africa, that was huge, but that was also a sign to other corporations. If one huge corporation says we are not getting involved with Israel, that would signal, and I think the BDS campaign is working towards that end. So that's really our task. Without the Israelis, we have to assume the Israelis are not a part of it. And in South Africa, you had that fear, obviously, as well. And their term was a bloodbath. That was the term they used. After apartheid, it's a bloodbath, which never happened. And I think what the ANC did that was very important, and that's what we're trying to do. We have a project of trying to formulate a constitution for this new country. We have all kinds of constitutional lawyers involved and others. The idea is to show Israelis that this is not against them, that it's true. There won't be a Jewish state. There won't be an Israel. It'll be one democracy, but they have an equal part in it. And that's what the ANC did with the whites in South Africa. They had the Freedom Charter, and then they had the Constitution. That didn't convince the whites. But when finally the regime collapsed, they went through the transition to democracy peacefully. There was not a bloodbath. And I think that's what we have to aspire to. Israelis will not agree. We can't make Palestinian liberation dependent on the agreement of Israelis. We have to sort of work around them, make the regime collapse, and then when they see that they have a place and security in the new state, they're not going to be persecuted. They have a place in it. then they will begin to work towards a transition. And I think Palestinians, this is a process. So in the process, if you're in Palestine for everything that's gone on, and it's hard to explain, the Palestinians there know that there are Israelis there. They know that we have to live together. They, it is something that they've accepted. So even if refugees come back that don't know, and even with this whole history of suffering and so on, the Palestinians will really have a stake in this succeeding. And I think the Palestinians in Palestine will be the ones that will work with the refugees in terms of understanding the new reality. So I really do think it will be a stable kind of a system. Israelis won't be happy with it, but in the end, you can make a case that it's a win-win. Israelis, what do they give? I mean, it's true, there'll be land redistribution. There will be certain fundamental changes. But, Israelis, you're losing sovereignty. You're losing a flag. But everything that's meaningful in terms of a Jewish national life, you can retain. So I think with that kind of a presentation, the way it's framed like that, with a constitution, and if they can see how it would actually work, I think there's a chance of overcoming, that opposition, both of Israelis, but also the opposition of Palestinians that want this to be a Palestinian state.
If I may. Yes, so first of all, I would really like to thank you because some 10 years ago, I took a group of my students for a study trip to Palestine, and a colleague of yours actually received us and actually took us around to show a little bit and explain the work that you're doing, so thank you for that. In your vision of the one state, how would you then approach this problem of so many homes being demolished and so on? So would you also advocate for returning all of these homes to their legitimate owners, even if they cannot prove with legal documents the ownership, or how would you settle this problem? Thank you.
There's a lot of, there's a lot of details that have to be worked out. One of them being the land regime. I mean, one thing it has to be decided, do we want to go back to the land regime before 47? In which a lot of the land had been privatized. The reason the Zionists were able to buy a lot of the land was you had absentee landlords in Beirut. I'm not so sure that that's exactly the land regime we want to go back to. Israel, this is sometimes a colonial legacy is good. Israel actually has a very good land regime. All the land of the country belongs to the state. It's all state land. And so the state can decide in a very rational way, if, there is corruption of things, but nevertheless, what should be residential, what should be industrial, what should be, nature, and all of that. Now, today, of course, it's used as a mechanism to take land from Palestinians and make it Jewish land and all. But if you take that away, if that's all taken away, that might not be a bad system, in which case you wouldn't, as a refugee coming back, you wouldn't get title to your land again. Or I don't know what the status of your village land would be. It would be state land more. There'd be a state policy of resettlement rather than people coming back individually to their houses, and their houses don't exist for the most part anyway. Or some other regime. That's one of the open issues that we have to deal with. What would be the land regime, and how would that address the legitimate needs of the refugees to come back? At least refugees should be able to come back to the area of the country that they're from, if not from the particular village or town that doesn't exist anymore. And then there's all kinds of plans. A lot of things are happening. There's a group called Zochrot in Tel Aviv. It's a Palestinian-Israeli group of planners. Zochrot plans for the refugee return. It's not working for it, it's planning when they actually return. And there's young Palestinian planners, largely at Haifa University, but in other universities, that have planned communities, new communities for the refugees. Because the idea is not only that they return, but that they have to be, well, I didn't write it in here, but they have to be reintegrated. Don't forget, a lot of these are people that are traumatized, they've lived in violent conditions, they're poor, they're undereducated, they're underskilled. So you don't want them to come back as an underclass. So the point is, how do you build new communities in the areas where they came from that have an economic infrastructure to them, right? So that you can combine coming back to my country and coming back in a way to my home, but under conditions that allow me to reintegrate into society. So this whole issue of return and reintegration is a very complex one that needs a lot, it's a whole that we're trying to work with. But certainly that's the idea, that there is the return. It's a meaningful return, given the colonial legacy that your communities no longer exist. And now what can we replace them with that's not only meaningful to you in a cultural, personal, historical sense, but also is a resource for reintegrating into society.
I think Katja and then Vanya.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was going to ask about land rights and land ownership, and you've just covered that, so thank you.
No? Okay. Then, okay. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned in the new state the Israelis wouldn't be persecuted. So what about war criminals, all those complicit in the war criminals, even regular soldiers? What would happen with them? What do you think?
Well, persecuted and prosecuted are different concepts. Look, there has to be a whole process of reconciliation that goes on and accountability. I mean, certainly. I don't know the detail. Of that. You had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa that at least dealt with the issue of acknowledgement, which is really important. For Palestinians, it could be the best political situation in the world without an acknowledgement from Israelis of what the crimes that they've committed. There's no closure. So that has to be a part of it. But I think also it's true, part of the acknowledgement has to be the crimes that were committed. That was the anger directed at Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He just was satisfied with acknowledgement. Criminals came and said, I did this, and everybody said, I forgive you. Usually except the victims, but the commission said, you're forgiven, and they went home. And there was a lot of anger over that. So it wasn't a closure in South Africa, actually. So I think, yes, there will have to be prosecutions. There'll have to be a reckoning at some point. But the mechanisms of how to do that exactly, haven't really been worked out. But acknowledgement and accountability are certainly a part of the story.
I have a question.
Yeah, sorry. I once talked to a young Palestinian film director from Nazareth in today's Israel, and I asked him what he thought of Israeli Jews that are anti-Zionists, that are truly, that understand the Palestinian question, and that are truly in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And I asked him what his opinion is of those people, and he said if they really want to help, they should leave. Yeah. So, I mean, how much understanding do you have for this position?
I know the filmmaker. Okay. Well, I mean, there is a logic. I usually start, I didn't do it today because it's more of an academic forum, but when I spoke in town the other night, I start with an acknowledgement that I'm a settler. I mean, as Christina mentioned, I moved from the United States to Israel, in 1973, so I am a settler. I call myself, in my books and so on, I call myself a settler who refuses, which means I'm not just a settler who acknowledges that I'm a settler, I'm a settler who's trying to work to dismantle the settler colonial regime and to create a new reality. So I would say there is a logic that I should leave, and it's not the first time that's been brought up. And my answer, there's two answers. First of all, why did I go there in the first place? It was a whole story I'm not going to bore you with, but there is a connection between the Jewish people in that country. It's not like a British farmer gets up one morning and goes to Kenya, to get cheap land and cheap labor and get rich. That wasn't, there was a certain, I don't want to get into a justification of anything, but there was a certain genuine tie between Jews and the land of Israel that made it different, I think, from a lot of other settler colonial movements. And I felt that, I was looking in the 60s, when the 60s ended, for a new front in the revolution. And this was a meaningful place for me. But I was very involved. It's not a story of a Zionist who got disillusioned and moved to the left. I came from the left, and I was in the Israeli peace movement from the very beginning, and so on. But nevertheless, I felt a sense of kind of a certain kinship. There is a tie between Jews and that country, and that's why I would reject the idea. I am a settler, but I'm not a settler in the same way that really a British settler should leave Kenya, because there's no tie between them and Kenya. Although Richard Leakey and a few others stayed actually as Kenyans, but so I stay, but I think I earn my right to stay by the fact that I am working to dismantle this whole kind of a system. And sometimes I say on a more practical basis. I like to believe that I have a certain amount of impact in what's going on, and if only the people that were aware of that they're settlers and aware of the injustice that settlements, if they're the only ones that leave, then you're kind of leaving the country to the Likudniks and the Smotriches and those people. So I think the fact that I'm there is hopefully playing a compensating role for the fact that I am there. That's about as good as I can do.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. If I may, I'd like to go back to the two-state solution for a little bit. So this year in September, the General Assembly adopted a resolution calling for the withdrawal of all settlers from the occupied territories.
That's right.
The decolonization of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution. So my question would be, what is more favorable? This idea of proper decolonization of the occupied territories, or the establishment of a one state or one civil democratic state?
Well, there is, you've got, again, there is no coherent territory that you could turn into a Palestinian state. In other words, this is gone. It's been buried for years and years under, the whole settlement enterprise. There are 750,000 Israeli settlers today. Somebody mentioned, Anya, you mentioned 100,000 that have been added, in the last few years. So that, even if that was, I don't know, that might be the concept of the international community. If you ask your foreign minister or whatever, what's your concept of two states, that might be what she says, right? But in fact, that's just the kind of a position that's completely disconnected from the reality on the ground. The reality is that there is no more. It's impossible to push this back. The West Bank has not only been populated, can you see the international will to say to 750,000 Israelis, get up and move back, I mean, it's ridiculous. You can't remove an outpost of 20 Israelis, you know, let alone. So, I mean, that's just ridiculous. But also, it's really been incorporated into Israel. There is no detachable unit anymore. The highway system, the electrical system, the sewage system, the transportation system. I mean, everything has been integrated. So that I would argue it's not detachable, and there is no coherent territory that could ever become a genuinely viable state. So in a way, and Israel was very upfront about it, creating facts on the ground that are irreversible is a explicit policy of the Israeli government, and I think they've achieved that. I think they've achieved a situation, not to mention Gaza, of course, that is probably uninhabitable even for settlers. I mean, they're talking about settlers going back into Gaza. I don't see that happening. Gaza is absolutely uninhabitable, even in terms of radiation, not to mention everything else. So, you know, at some point, politicians are going to have to be confronted to say, you know, the two-state solution you're advocating for is disconnected absolutely from the reality on the ground. Let's look at the reality and see what that tells us in terms of what a solution is. And I think the logic has to lead you to one state. Okay, people want lunch.
I actually have one question. And it continues from what was a question just now. You mentioned international community and their preparedness to enact or to move 750,000 settlers away. But Anna mentioned before also that the Interior Minister Ben-Gvir gave, I think, 10,000 plus rifles to the settlers to ensure the security. We see that settlers are as violent as Israeli military on the occupied territories. And so if we're talking about one state and how to move there, do you see, or what kind of a force, what kind of an international force, and in what way can that be generated, even if we're talking about the civil society rising up, to make it happen? To demilitarize Israeli society, to demilitarize settlers. And in that case, does it also make sense for the global mobilization to problematize the ethno-national character of the Israeli, or even in that case, two-state solution? So just for Israelis, just for Palestinians. That's so right. Having this idea of clear-cut groups of people who are just one thing and never mixed.
Well, it's a little question before lunch. The one thing is that, again, if we go back to our, to the map, this is not, in my view, the final stage, one state. Even if we go back to one, because again, Arab nationalism is a cultural nationalism. And I think, the states never really took root. I mean, people don't, you see this now in Syria. People don't really identify as Syrian. They're forced into that kind, or Iraqi, or, I mean, there really still is this wider Arab identity that they have. And at some point, maybe, the states were captured by all kinds of gangs and criminals and hard warlords and so on. But I think, if the people begin to have their say, there's going to be a reemergence of a wider Arab identity and so on. So, and Palestine could be a leader in that, because the Palestinians, because of their struggle, have a certain moral legitimacy and a moral power. So that if they begin to say, look, we're glad we have a Palestine, but actually we would like to go back to Shams. We'd like to go back and join a greater Syria. We'd like, that could certainly happen. So I think this isn't necessarily the final stage of this process. And then we have to, but nevertheless, it's going to be, the next stage. We have to go through that before we can go to somewhere else. So I think in terms of the Israelis and the militarism and the settlers and everything, we have to really imagine a new state. And the state will have maybe a military. I wish it wouldn't, but Costa Rica doesn't have a military, but it does have 48 different kinds of police forces. So, some military, but certainly a police. Every state has a police force. And so in the logic of a state and the structure of a state, if a Smotrich gets up with a gun and shoots a Palestinian, that's a criminal act. It's not a political act. It's criminal. And so in other words, we have the structures to deal with those kinds of violent things within a state system. So I don't see, I think the point, and this is the problem with ethno-nationalism and the national thing, and that gets to the logic of our civil state, and that is that everybody, the Palestinians and Israelis, and all the national and ethnic and religious groups of the country have got to accept the sovereignty and the ultimate authority of the civil state to run the affairs of the country. It can't be, the state has certain limited powers, and then you've got each group has its own little militia, and each group has its own little parliament, and each group. It's got to be that one authority, I think. And then within that, the different groups exist, but you don't have competing sources of authority. You don't have competing parliaments. You don't have competing militias, or anything like that. And that's a hard call because, again, most Palestinians aren't into that right now. They're willing to give ultimate authority to a Palestinian state, but then that does raise the issue of what happens to Israeli Jews. Not necessarily in terms of persecution, but in terms of, because I think Palestinians would let Israeli Jews live, but in terms of if there is an ethno-national basis for this kind of a Palestinian state, you can't have a situation where one group has an ethno-national privilege of having its identity and having its own state and having its sovereignty, and the other group in the same country doesn't. So I think the hopeful thing is that Palestinians have not moved, maybe more so than other Arabs, they haven't moved to the ethno-national model that Israel represents. Because Israel sort of forced that on them, because of the history of the place. I think Palestinians still maintain enough of that wider cultural Arab nationalism that they could incorporate the Israeli Jews and then become a part of a wider. So in other words, it isn't like here in former Yugoslavia, where the nations were so defined and exclusive and hard in a way. You don't have, the good news is you don't have that in the Middle East. So even if it's a Palestinian state, it would be a national state in a much softer, kind of more tolerant, more open way than you would have. It wouldn't be the ethno-nationalism you have in Europe. It's certainly in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think that would come into play. And that means the ability of Palestinians, because they're more of a people and part of a bigger people, to deal with Israelis. I mean, it isn't like a conflict of national. It is in a sense, but within this framework, I think that kind of a conflict would begin to to disappear, because it's actually the Zionists are the only ones that have that European hard nationalism. It's not shared. It's not shared by Palestinians. So if Palestinians get the upper hand, in a sense, I think that they could, they'd have to deal with that Israeli nationalism. But the way to deal with it is by using the state as a mechanism for controlling any ethno-national assertiveness or violence or whatever against other groups by using the criminal system and policing that the state has. So it's really important that the state get the authority that it needs, rather than, what you had in Yugoslavia, rather than in the end, the national groups were stronger than that one state. So we have to try to reverse that, and it's maybe easier in the Middle East because you don't have all those hardened national identities there that you have here.